All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, so I'll pass it off to Michael Miller.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Miller with the California Association of Wine Grape Growers. Thank you for joining us this morning for a nice webinar conversation about the new indoor heat illness prevention regulation and new regulation that took effect July 1, workplace violence prevention, and what you need to do to have a plan in place to comply with the new law. Both of these are laws that came out of some pretty bad situations, and there's an old saying that says, bad facts make bad laws. And for the workplace violence regulation, that came out of a terrible situation in Half Moon Bay where some ag employees were killed in a workplace violence situation. And then the indoor heat illness regulation came out of some people who were working in containers at a port, and terrible things happened there. And that was, I think, almost 6-7 years ago. That regulation has been in the works for quite a while. But there's a lot that we need to look at in both those regulations. We've got a great group with Karen and Richard who are going to go over some things here. Can I say next slide, please? I want to go over some of the housekeeping rules. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand or put it into the Q&A. Try not to put your questions into the chat function. You can communicate with the panelists or attendees that way, but please try to use the Q&A for questions. And also feel free to raise your hand, and we will try to answer questions as we go throughout this webinar, so we can answer your questions in pretty much real time as much as we can. It will be a pretty in-depth conversation and what you need to do. So do feel free to raise questions if you have questions along the way. And like I said before, this is a webinar that's done with the Wine Institute and with CAWG together. And with that, let me turn it over to Anna at Wine Institute.
Good morning. I'm Ana Ferreira, Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs in Wine Institute's Sacramento office. We're pleased to have Ogletree Deakins presenting today. They presented to Wine Institute on this subject in November of last year and are one of the leading law firms specializing in labor and employment law. They offer expertise in navigating complex employment-related legal issues across various industries. Two members of their Sacramento office are here with us today. First up is Robert Rodriguez, an employment lawyer representing employers on OSHA matters. He is routinely called upon to assist businesses with workplace crises such as catastrophic injuries and even fatalities. Robert is also co-chair of the firm's Workplace Violence Prevention Practice Group. Next is Karen Tynan, and she is also a co-chair of that West Coast OSHA practice and the firm's Workplace Violence Prevention Practice Group. For the last 18 years, Karen has specialized in defending employers in the workplace safety arena, responding to catastrophic incidents, and defending sexual harassment and wrongful termination lawsuits for California employers, including construction companies, manufacturers, transportation companies, wineries, and media companies. So thank you both for being here today to update us on these newly minted regs. Thank you for being here, and please just take it away.
All right, thank you so much. And we're here today to talk about the two different regulations. One is a regulation, one is a law. Indoor heat illness prevention, and then the workplace violence prevention. So we're going to dig into the indoor heat illness standard that was recently just passed. It is currently in effect as of July 23rd, 2024, and it caught some folks by surprise. It had a long, tortured history. There were some issues with the OAL and its approval, but on the day that it was approved, July 23rd, it came into effect. And not surprisingly, it covers indoor spaces. And what the regulation requires is folks that have an indoor space have a written plan. It can be part of the IIPP, the Injury and Illness Prevention Plan, or it could be a standalone document. You have to have it very close to the work site as to be available for your workers and also for Cal OSHA upon request. And the written plan needs to be in English and the language understood by the majority of your. So kind of some nuts and bolts about it. And I think a lot of the folks on this call are probably pretty familiar with California's heat illness prevention in outdoor spaces. And this one really has a lot of overlap to it. And, with that, with folks or organizations that have both indoor and outdoor spaces, like especially in the wine industry, we're seeing folks combine the indoor plan and the outdoor plan into one document just because there is so much overlap and only a few significant differences that can be addressed in the plan. So much like the outdoor one, there's very specific elements that the employer has to have as part of their plan. You have to have access to water for your employees, access to indoor cool down areas. You have to monitor the weather somehow or temperature inside. You have to have acclimatization procedures, assessment and control measures for when the temperature goes over 87 degrees. And then, not surprising, with every other California employment related law, you have to have employee and supervisor training, and then you have to have this all in a written plan. And one practice pointer is you have to have this available upon immediate request by an inspector. And Karen and I have had a case before where the inspector came on site, asked for their outdoor heat illness plan. We said, hey, it's right over here. We can grab it for you. It'll be back in 1 minute. And the inspector said, no, that's fine. Just give it to me in a few minutes. We gave it to him about 15 minutes later, and he ended up citing the employer for not providing it immediately. So immediate means immediately having it ready, available. Now, the current regulation is section 3396 of Title 8. The outdoor one was 3395, so right after it. And there are triggering temperatures for this regulation. So number one, let's talk a little bit about the spaces that it covers. So if previously you had an outdoor space, CalOSHA really tried to make certain spaces that were kind of hybrid as outdoor to come within that previous regulation. So for example, like a warehouse or a distribution center that had large garage doors open, a lot of times CalOSHA would say, well, that's pretty much kind of an outdoor space. We're going to go ahead and enforce under the outdoor regulation. Well, now things are kind of different. Now they have that indoor regulation to play with. So I think spaces that were hybrid before are going to kind of come within the indoor space. And the most logical way that we can describe this is if it's not outdoor, it's indoor. So either you're covered by the outdoor regulation or you're covered by the indoor regulation. And generally the indoor space is where you've got 4 walls, a ceiling that can be enclosed. So even if you do have kind of garage doors that you keep it open, if they can be closed, that would be considered an indoor space under the purview of this regulation. Now, the vast majority of all of the requirements are triggered at 82 degrees and when employees are present in the indoor site. And then there's another set of heightened requirements at 87 degrees that we'll get into, but those are the 2 trigger temperatures you want to be looking for. So Karen, can you walk us through some monitoring the weather?
So everybody, just like outdoor, you've got to be able to say that you're monitoring the weather. There's a lot of apps for it, so you can know if you do have an indoor location that is impacted by, higher temperatures, that you're monitoring that. Typically a supervisor is going to do that. And that includes tracking the weather. And then, so for a lot of folks, I'm seeing people are installing thermostats with software where they can track the temperature and also record it, because California business owners have told me they're a little concerned that some employees might claim that it reached 82 degrees and they either didn't get breaks or there wasn't a cool down area. So in an abundance of caution, they're installing devices. Others, it's a simple Excel spreadsheet. But there's a lot of apps online that you can download. I'm hearing from clients that they really like the apps because everyone can have it on their phone. And they're also checking with like the National Weather Service, things like that. So you have the duty to monitor the weather. You also have that duty to access water. Look, we're a first world country. Most people have indoor water and indoor spaces. So having potable drinking water, it doesn't seem to be a big issue for indoor spaces. And similar to outdoor, it has to be pure, cool, all that, right? You have to have a quantity. Here's the thing we're seeing is accessibility seems to be an issue for some employers, that employees would have to, let's say, go to another warehouse location or have to make a long walk. I call it over the river and through the woods to get their water or to get to a cool down area. So readily accessible. You know, for some employers, it's not an issue. You have water fountains, you have water dispensers, but making sure that that is that requirement is met is very important. And why is it? Because this is the most frequently cited heat illness violation in California. We drag and pull a lot of data from the DOL website. Some of you may know our OSHA tracker we have on Ogletree. And so we take a look at what are the top citations. And for outdoor heat illness, we can look back at the data over 7-8 years, and we can see water is the biggest problem for employers. And so I like to point that out so you can manage the risk and focus on access to water. Okay, let's run through a scenario. Frankie and Tony work together in the warehouse / distribution area. And Frankie, you know, it's hot out. Frankie tells Tony he's feeling hot. So clearly they're working indoors. And he wants to go take a break in his truck with the AC running. He wants to listen to music and try to meditate a little to cool down. And Frankie says, hey, I'm going to check with the supervisor on my way to the truck, but I'm going to go sit in the truck for a while. What do you guys, I'm going to ask Robert, what should Tony do, and what kind of processes or procedures would a California employer be complying with in this kind of scenario?
Yeah, well, I think this scenario kind of implicates a couple different things. You know, obviously, one way to combat heat illness is to take these preventative cool down rests, making sure that you're taking them before you're too hot. I think number two is, you know, heat illness can really progress very quickly, you know, under the right conditions. And so, if somebody is experiencing signs and symptoms of heat illness, like we have Frankie doing here, you don't want that person to be alone. And indeed, the regulation doesn't allow them to be alone during a cool down break. So we want to make sure that, you know, although the AC running is a good, you know, kind of preventative measure for heat illness, and it could be a good option for at some times, but you don't want to have Frankie alone and potentially have that heat illness progress and nobody's there to witness it, nobody's there to call 911. So we want to make sure that if we're taking preventative rest breaks, we are you know, taking them in the cool down areas, and we have kind of a buddy system or somebody to monitor these folks during their breaks. Anything else you're seeing, Karen?
No, I think those were good call outs. And I think that Frankie seems reasonable, but Tony, as a coworker, should be aware of the policies and procedures. He should have had his training. And instead, I think Frankie and Tony should maybe go to the supervisor and say, hey, Frankie's going to go to the cool down area. Who's going to sit with him? I do see that there's a question in the Q&A, but I'm trying to click on it and can't answer it. So if someone could give me access to the Q&A, that would be awesome. And I'll try to.
Yeah, and I was able to access it. I just wanted to answer it really quick. There was some a question around, you know, the trigger points. You know, is it having to do with people wearing certain clothing, heat restricting clothing? There is some of those you know, some of that in the regulation. I don't think we're going to cover that because it's a very specific part that applicable to a lot of our folks here. But the two temperature triggers are 82 degrees triggers basically all of the elements we talked about: access to water, cool down areas, cool down breaks, emergency procedures. And then once you hit 87, we're going to get into those assessment measures, but you've got to take certain steps to try to get the temperature below 87 degrees. So those are the two triggering: 82, 87. You're going to try to get it below 87. All right, and that segues into our indoor cool down areas. So under the regulation, you have to have an indoor cool down area this is kind of equivalent to the shade that you had to have under the outdoor regulation. So for the indoor space, you have to have at least one cool down area. It has to be maintained at less than 82 degrees. And it can be open to the air ventilation or cooling, but somehow you have to get it below 82 degrees. It has to be blocked from sunlight and shielded from high radiant heat sources such as other machines or anything that would give off heat. It has to be large enough to accommodate folks on break in a normal posture. And it has to be as close as practicable to the work area. And what I'm seeing a lot of our clients do is, especially in kind of warehousing or manufacturing or distribution, they already have a break room that can serve as this. So they're just validating, yes, we have AC in there. Yes, we keep it below 82 degrees, and it kind of checks all these boxes. So we've got these wonderful cool down areas that are required under the regulation. Now, what do we do in those cool down areas? Well, this is where your employees or workers take their preventative cool down rests. So this is yet another break for indoor workers, in addition to meal periods, rest breaks, any other break that's under California law. This is a new class of those particular breaks. So you've got to encourage and allow employees to take a preventative cool down rest when they're starting to feel overheated or potentially having signs and symptoms of heat illness. And the breaks can not be less than 5 minutes apiece, plus the time it takes to get to the cool down area. You have to encourage that the employee remain in the break area until they're feeling better. And you have to monitor the employees and ask if they're experiencing symptoms of heat illness. And this goes back to our scenario that because heat illness can progress very quickly and be fatal, it's very important to make sure that people who are taking a preventative rest break are monitored, and there's someone else there, either a buddy or a supervisor, monitoring these folks. And you can't order the employees back to work until any signs or symptoms of heat illness have abated. And I think the most important part of this regulation is that you have to have access to cool down areas and permit them at all times. And so we've gotten a lot of questions about folks like, can I limit this if somebody feels like they're abusing this? What can we do to combat this? And unfortunately, I think a lot of folks know there are certain employees who may abuse either labor codes or safety regulations. But unfortunately, our advice is just take them at their word, give them the benefit of the doubt that they need this. If it becomes really excessive where they're gone for hours, that might be something to address. But if for the kind of generic, somebody who seems to be taking a lot of heat related breaks, just give them the benefit of the doubt. And just to flag one issue, we've got a lot of wage and hour California PAGA attorneys that we work with. And this is going to have a lot of wage and hour issues about, did we get breaks? Were they encouraged to? And we do anticipate this will be ripe for civil lawsuits. So make sure you're taking this part seriously and you're updating your break policy to incorporate these new preventative cool down rest breaks for indoor workers.
And Robert, can you just
Yeah.
stay on that slide for one more second? I just wanted to share, I've been working with some clients on their plans, and for cool down rest, some folks, especially with the distribution centers or where they think people are going to be taking a lot of these breaks, are having sign-in sheets so they can track in and out and show the breaks were happening. Other clients have asked me about having a camera in the break room as a monitoring method. I just want to share that because I kind of like when I get questions from clients and kind of can learn what they're doing. So I wanted to call out those two things. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
And Robert, also, just real quick, there's a question in the chat. I just want to bring up might be a good time for it. Is there a particular app that anyone has used successfully for tracking indoor temperatures?
I don't know. I think what my people have been telling me, clients, is that they're using the outdoor app and they've actually taken measurements so that if the outdoor temp is 95, they know that the indoor temp is either right there or typically 10 degrees below. And that they then go and take the actual temperatures or check the thermometers or temperature device in the location. That's what I'm hearing. Robert, are you hearing anything else?
No, that's right. Most of the apps we know are geared towards outdoor temperature, and then that kind of triggers. Okay, we're getting towards 100. It's in Fresno, or it's in a hotter part of the valley. We are now going to be taking indoor measurements to make sure that we're not going above that 87 degrees.
And then can you keep those records based on that app information as well, or how do you do that?
I would keep the temperature records because it will likely benefit you, right? And also tracking the temperatures can be, well, it is part of the requirements and can be something that Cal OSHA inspectors would ask for. The PAGA attorneys also tell us that, in discovery, if someone claimed they didn't get their cool down breaks, that would be, you're nodding, Michael, right? That would be like one of the first discovery questions to try to show either you're not tracking the temperature or the temperatures are too high. So that's kind of my words of wisdom.
Exactly. Thank you.
So
Correct.
at the 87 degrees, and also this is the big trigger point. And I know for some of you, your locations may not get to 87. And so you don't have to do these things unless you also have the workers in the heat restrictive clothing, which we did have a question about. But for most of you, the vast majority at 87 degrees, you've got to take more actions, right? And so you have to be tracking the temperature and then implementing a whole bunch of other procedures. And you have to have analyzed, okay, at 87 degrees, what does the exposure look like in my workplace? Now, for clients who will never reach 87 degrees, what they're doing in their plan is saying, hey, if it's 87 degrees at our indoor location, if HVAC fails, whatever, we will not have workers exposed. We won't have people working. Therefore, this part of the regulation will not be triggered. So that is one aspect. Now, can you go to the next slide, Robert? So you've got to start just like in other safety kind of regulations or processes at work. You always start with the engineering controls, right? And then you go to administrative controls and then PPE. So let's talk about the engineering controls. It says feasible. And Robert and I have had this talk a whole lot about feasibility with folks. And feasibility doesn't mean it's expensive or it's going to take a lot of work. There are very specific tests for feasibility, and it's very difficult to meet. If you have other questions about feasibility, we can dive in that with you offline, but just know it's not easy. And so you get to 87 degrees, you use your engineering controls, and boom, it means you have to up your HVAC. You got to bring in those swamp coolers. You've got to start with the cooling fans. People tell me they're buying, and I'm not trying to be profane, big ass fans seems to be the brand people love. And they're putting them all over these warehouses and things. And so that is the engineering controls. Now, after engineering controls, you're going to have the administrative controls. What is that? That's rotating employees in the warmer areas, scheduling earlier rather than later or during nighttime. Reducing the intensity of the work, maybe how much work a person has to do on a line. Also taking a look at reducing hours or even changing the clothing that they can wear. Anything like that would be considered the administrative controls. And then after administrative controls, what do we have? We have the cooling equipment of PPE that would need to be implemented. And so that's the cooling vests, the neck fans. A lot of people like the cooling bandanas. I think they're like $3 a piece. The neck fans can get expensive. People are telling me they're not super keen on the neck fans. But don't forget, when you use this cooling PPE, if you have folks working in a way that, they can't have water on them or they, have to be sanitized, just be conscious of that. And also think about your PPE policy, your reimbursement policy, kind of issue spotting on that for any of this cooling PPE.
All right. And, I think a lot of folks under the assessment and control measures, get a little bit confused. And I remember when I was reading drafts of the regulations, I was confused too. So it's basically a phased approach, and Karen did a great job of explaining it, where once we hit 87 degrees, we're doing things to try to get it below 87. And if we really can't do it, not that it's difficult or it's going to cost resources or it's going to be expensive. If we really do it, it's not feasible, then the kind of the backstop is that PPE. But if you do have a hotter workspace, a distribution center or manufacturing center, or bottling that gets warm, you're going to want to make sure you go through that and be able to show Cal OSHA. We assessed all these 3 different things, and we were able to get it below 87 degrees. Another required element is the emergency response procedures, and this is also one of the most cited portions of the outdoor heat illness standard. And the reason being, kind of, I sound like a broken record probably, but, heat illness can really progress very, very quickly and can be fatal. And it could be minutes, while it's progressing. So the regulation requires robust and specific emergency response procedures. For example, how are employees going to be able to get in contact with supervisors? If you have a larger workspace, if there's an emergency, how are we going to let the supervisor know? Is it going to be by telephone, by text, by radio? So outlining that. You have to have very specific procedures for responding to possible heat illness. The supervisor has to take immediate action. And if there is serious heat illness indicated, they have to implement the emergency response procedures, including potential first aid, kind of cooling them down, or even calling 911 or emergency medical services if it warrants that situation. A designated person at the site has to be the one who is going to be calling 911. So you want to outline who that is, and that they're able to give clear and precise directions to the work site. And so this may be, implicated, for example, in your outdoor spaces as well, like on the vineyard. You want to make sure you're able to tell emergency services where to go specifically if there is a heat illness emergency. So make sure we have those emergency response procedures. And the another required element is the $1 million word, acclimatization. And acclimatization is basically the scientific principle that folks who are not used to working in heat are more susceptible to heat illness, and therefore you have to acclimate them to working in the heat. So you have to have procedures around how you're going to do that. For example, if you have a new employee or somebody who's been assigned to a high heat area that's never really worked in the heat, or somebody maybe who worked in retail before and is now coming to your job site, or has been on vacation for a significant amount of time, but maybe needs to be acclimated. You have to make sure you have procedures for how you're going to do that. Or, for the first 14 days, you have to monitor them. You have to make sure that, they might be taking more rest breaks, that they're going to be closely watched for any kind of signs and symptoms of heat illness around that. So some best practices around that, specific procedures, be attentive to new employees or ones that have been away. You can consider lessening the intensity or shift length. We've seen a lot of folks do that. In agriculture, they'll kind of rotate shifts, or they'll do earlier in the morning or later in the evening where it's a little bit cooler, and modifying those work schedules. So just figuring out how you're going to do that for your workforce.
And training. So I won't read the list or anything, but the regulation is very clear about training topics. So if you can use this slide deck, just make sure, go through your training and double check that you have all these subjects, just like Robert talked about, acclimatization, and especially the signs and symptoms of heat illness, how they'll report it, and all the emergency response procedures. And you've got that additional supervisor training. And so that's going to include the procedures for the supervisor to follow, when they are either, let's say they're managing employees, they're doing the administrative controls, or they're dealing with PPE, and then also everything they're going to do in response to a heat illness incident, and how to monitor the weather and respond if they see that it's going to be, let's say, very hot, that 82 or 87, and on, okay? And then lastly, I don't think a lot of you have radiant heat sources. We see this a lot in our food manufacturing clients and in other type of manufacturing, like with glass. And I do see it some where people have forklift battery banks that generate heat. But look, if you have a radiant heat source, you've got to try to minimize how that radiant heat impacts the workplace. You're going to need to do things like maybe install shields, things like that, and try to minimize the exposure for the employees. I just wanted to put a pin in that one, although I don't see it as a big issue for you guys.
All right, let's quickly walk through scenario number 2. Gina is a manager for RCR Vineyards and Winery. Chris comes to Gina and explains that he and others are not able to take enough breaks on hot days. Chris says that he has to do both indoor and outdoor work, and it's a very long walk to the designated area for cool down rest breaks. And he also says that the long sleeve clothing he's required to wear doesn't allow him to sweat. He feels overheated and exhausted on the hot days. What should Gina do?
Wow, this is a good one.
Yeah.
So I think there's an answer in the moment and a long-term answer, Robert. So in the moment, she has to address what Chris says, and he's clearly, I would say, frustrated. He's overheated. He says he's overheated and exhausted. And so she needs to address, how are you feeling in the moment? Can we get you a cool down break? What can we do right now? Then long term, right? So he knew enough to identify that his long sleeve clothing isn't allowing him to sweat. And so she's got to go back maybe with her management team and say, okay, how are we going to get our cool down rest break areas more accessible? Are they accessible enough? Do we need to add a second one? What else can we do? How are we managing breaks? Are we tracking breaks? Are we leaving it up to folks? Do we have a buddy system? What are we doing on the breaks? And then for the clothing, I think, and I've seen, a lot of folks like workers in long sleeves. It protects you from arm injuries, from the sun. At the same time, depending on the material, it can decrease your ability to, cool yourself. So I think there are in the moment things that Gina needs to do and to address, and then there's more long-term to resolve the issues. What do you think, Robert?
I think that's spot on advice.
Yay.
All right. Do you want to quickly walk us
Yeah.
through what CAWG will do during a heat-related inspection?
Yeah, and so I think some of you guys have had CAWG show up. So hey, they're going to ask for your plan, and they're going to pick it apart with a fine-tooth comb. They're going to ask for your 300 logs, and they're going to look and see, oh, are there any heat illness incidents? What does it look like on that 300 log? That's what I see inspectors do with the 300 log. So before you give it to them, which must also be immediate, I really like for some member of management to quickly look at that log and issue spot. They're going to review your training records, including the content probably, and see, are all the workers trained? They're going to interview workers, and they're going to document the temperatures. Typically, they take a picture of their handheld device, and that's part of the file. Now, what's the next one? I like to include this. Think about, how would my employees answer this question? Where is your indoor heat illness plan? What is acclimatization? Have you been acclimatized? Workers stumble on that question all the time. But if you prepare them and say, hey, do you get used to the heat if you come back from being off work or it suddenly gets hot? Being able to answer where's the water, where they go to rest. Also, I see in inspection files, the inspector very specifically asks them about heat illness symptoms and what would they do. So I like to throw those out there so you can think about how your workers would react.
All right.
Let's
That
hit
was
it.
the overview of the indoor heat regulations. So we'll now transition.
Before we
Oh.
go on, there's a real quick question here about indoor heat. Are we allowed to mandate light clothing indoors? For example, can we prohibit employees from wearing a hoodie if they're working indoors?
Yes.
Yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
As long as it doesn't introduce, any kind of other hazard, like for example, if there's a manufacturing process that maybe has sparks and you need to have some sort of, fire resistant, PPE. But if it's just, if they're working indoors and there's no other risks associated with wearing lighter clothing or wearing a t-shirt, absolutely.
Perfect. And then also, I should have said this earlier at the very beginning when I introduced everybody. We are providing very high level, information. It's not specific to any individual workplace. If you have questions specific to your workplace, you shouldn't view this as legal advice. You should talk to your lawyer and go through all that and make sure that you're looking at your specific workplace situation and specific employees and all that. But we are giving a big overview of the information. And I want to again thank CSWA and Wine Institute for helping put this together.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. So let's transition into the new workplace violence prevention plan. Hopefully everyone on this call is familiar with it because the deadline has passed to implement your plan, which was July 1st, 2024. Under this law, and it was a little bit of a weird kind of procedural history here. Generally, CAWG will be the one to promulgate their own regulations and go through that rulemaking process. And they had been doing that with the workplace violence regulation applicable to general industry. They got a little sidetracked by COVID and kind of got off track there. And so the legislature came over the top and passed this law that's kind of a stopgap. It has this law is in effect until CAWG can go ahead and promulgate their own regulation, which has to have the bare minimum of the law. So this is now in effect July 1st, 2024. Virtually every employer, and I think every employer on here probably would not qualify for any exemptions. You have to have a written workplace violence prevention plan. Much like the heat illness, it has to be accessible to all employees, the unions, and CAWG upon request. It could be standalone or part of the IIPP, but we're recommending having a standalone plan. Otherwise, you start having a very long IIPP that can be confusing. Now, the written workplace violence prevention plan has to be specific to the work site. So if you have different risks, for example, with a tasting room where you have people consuming alcohol and outside customers coming in, they may have different risks than the bottling area or the distribution area. So making sure you're either having a separate plan for those separate work areas or having one plan that incorporates all of those risks that are applicable to your different work sites into one plan. All right, Karen, can you walk us through some important definitions?
So this legislation has very broad definitions of threat of violence, I just want to point out engineering controls. So for the safety nerds, that's obviously some type of aspect of the space or a device that removes or minimizes the hazard. So that would be like your locking doors, alarms, things like that. I do see some clients now installing more alarms, more cameras in the workplace, not only as a deterrent, but to help them with their investigations. And certainly the definition of threat of violence is written extremely broadly. As you guys read that, you can see that it includes social media messages, online posts, behavioral or physical conduct, and it's about being reasonably perceived to convey an intent to cause that harm or fear of physical harm. So it is a category and a definition that catches a lot, and it's probably more broadly worded than people think. And work practice controls, just like when we talked about in heat illness, right? Those are your administrative procedures that reduce hazards. That can be folks working together, closing up together, how you handle de-escalation, things like that. And then we have these 4 violence types. So it's not just employee or on employee. It can include, criminal activities if someone tries to, commit a robbery or a burglary. It certainly contemplates behavior by customers and clients. It also contemplates the violence between employees, but does include former employees. And then 4 is kind of the ex-spouse, ex-partner, person who's making threats on one of your employees based on that personal relationship. So you have to address these 4 types of violence in your hazard assessment. You need to understand these 4 types also for your violent incident log and investigations.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. And there's a lot of very specific requirements, and honestly, too much to cover in this webinar. As Michael mentioned, this is kind of a high-level overview. So the next 2 slides have basically all of the very specific elements that your plan must have. I thought it'd be helpful to give a high-level overview of the main ones, and ones we've seen our clients struggle with a lot. And Karen and I are currently working on a workplace murder that just occurred in Sacramento about 2 weeks ago. Tragically, somebody was killed at an apartment complex, and we are helping the employer navigate that inspection. And obviously, OSHA has requested all of their workplace violence plans, all their hazard assessments, all their training documents. So these are things that OSHA will be looking for if there's a complaint or if there's an inspection. So making sure that we have a compliant plan is very important, not only for combating workplace violence, but for when you have potentially an unpreventable workplace violence incident and you draw OSHA's attention, that you make sure your plan is bulletproof. So essentially what you need to do is you need to sit down and you need to go through a hazard assessment of your work site, both looking at those 4 different types of violence and what your risks are, and then what you're going to do to address those risks. And how to address those risks, it could be either the engineering controls or the work practice controls Karen mentioned earlier. So engineering controls would be, are we having secured entry into the buildings? Are we not allowing customers over into the bottling area, eliminating that risk? Are we having cameras? Do we have adequate lighting? So those physical barriers, you have to assess your work site for those. And then for the work practice controls, for the tasting room, what are we doing to not overserve guests? What are we doing if we do have an unruly guest? Do we have de-escalation training? So it's coming up with a real assessment of what risks you have and what you're going to do to mitigate those risks. And Cal OSHA, I can tell you, is asking for the written hazard assessments related to that. So we recommend those be written down somewhere, memorialized that you conducted this assessment. Now, once you have that assessment and you make changes to either your work practices or your engineering controls, you want to make sure you have procedures in place where you're able to accept and encourage employees to bring forth workplace violence concerns, procedures for how you're going to investigate workplace violence issues and inform employees about the results of those investigations. You also have to have emergency response procedures about what you're going to do if you have an situation on your premises. So active harmer situation, how are we going to let folks know about that? Do we have a PA system? Are we going to call over the radio? Are we going to send out a mass text? But somehow to alert them to that there is a workplace violence incident in happening right now, and you need to do something in terms of get out of the building or shelter in place. You also have to have procedures for sheltering in place and evacuating as appropriate. So making sure your folks know where to go to shelter in place or evacuate depending on the emergency. And then finally, you have to have procedures for who staff can go to obtain help during a workplace violence emergency. So maybe you have a security guard. You want to make sure that they're aware of that. Maybe the manager will be the point of contact, but somebody on your work site who they can go to during a workplace violence emergency. And like I said, very specific elements, as you can see from the two different slides. Make sure you these, but those are kind of the base elements you have to have for you. And anything else you think we should add, Karen?
I do think we've had a lot of client questions about the CAWG template and canned plans. And so I don't discourage using the CAWG materials because they're free. Please be aware that the CAWG template does have more than the requirement. Mike may have something to say about that, but it actually has a spot for you to include a high-level manager signature. Nope, not required in your plan. It has a part in the plan to include whether or not you reported the incident as a serious injury, not required. So I just want to make people aware of that. If you are using the CAWG template, this gets right into my FAQs, or you're buying an off-the-shelf plan, maybe from a vendor that also provides you training, you just need to be very careful, because go back to what Robert said at the beginning. This plan has to be site specific. Site specific. It cannot be overly generic with a bunch of de-escalation and maybe some active shooter kind of high level stuff. That doesn't work. It has to have all those elements and be site specific.
So that was a question I was going to ask you, Karen, is in this site-specific situation. So if you're a grower and you've got vineyards that are maybe 2 miles apart, two different blocks of vineyards, and you've got workers who you provide housing for, right? So it's employer-provided housing, and you've got transportation that you've maybe provided for the employees getting back and forth. Are all of those individual sites that have to have a plan individually, or can you combine them all into one?
If it's similar, the hazards are similar, it can be one. Like we have clients that have, let's say, 200 retail stores in California, and they have some in strip malls, some that stand alone, and some in closed malls. So they've kind of put their locations into buckets. And I think for agricultural employers, they can do that too and say, okay, our vineyard locations have these hazards, right? They're remote. We may encounter other folks there. We may encounter, campers, whatever it is. And I think that you can kind of put it in buckets and have the plan address specific, maybe hazards related in that way. I think it's much more efficient versus trying to track a whole bunch of different quote unquote plans. And it is more what CAWG is looking for. And I think someone had their hand up. Maybe I saw that.
Erin Hughes did. I'm not sure if she can ask her question or put it in the Q&A box.
Okay. So I wanted to include these FAQs. Folks are asking us, you can keep the plan on like an intranet. You can have it at a binder. You can post it on the bulletin board. A high-ranking manager does not have to approve the plan. You do have to have someone accountable for the plan, much like your IIPP or your heat illness plan. People have asked us about having some parts of their plan that are not front-facing. What are they asking me? Active shooter response. We may not want to tell every employee some parts of our active shooter response, like where managers will go to make decisions, what our command post is. So that's my spiel about that. And I think the workplace violence prevention plan is probably too big to put in the handbook. We like it as a standalone. You can reference it and put a pointer in the handbook. Multi-employer work sites, like if you have temp workers, you use an agency, it has to be coordinated. And so what we're seeing, and I like it, is that there's either a MOU, a memorandum of understanding, or some type of written document that says, hey, you're sending temp workers to this location. Here's how we're going to communicate about workplace violence. Here's how they're going to get trained. Here's our expectations around investigating workplace violence, that we will cooperate, those aspects. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but for those of you who do use services and temp workers, think about how you're going to show CalOSHA that you comply with the multi-employer worksite part of the workplace violence regulation. And how are you going to investigate either employee concerns about workplace violence, incidents? So most folks have a way that they investigate sexual harassment claims or maybe workplace safety incidents. And so I think you can take part of those and kind of pivot and utilize those processes, maybe even the same stakeholders, into your investigations of workplace violence. A lot of people are asking, can we keep some part of it privileged or confidential? You can, just like you can do in a sexual harassment investigation, just like you can do in a safety investigation. You can have it be privileged. You can keep information confidential. Don't forget that the information you obtain and your conclusions in your investigations are going to be incorporated on your violent incident log. So you need to think about that. Think about how the investigation is going to play out. Who would have access? Is CalOSHA going to see this? Did it involve a third party where we could have a civil lawsuit? Did it involve a contractor where we could also have a lawsuit, not just a customer? So getting that investigation process just documented, and so you guys all know what's going to happen with it, I think is very important. And because it's so integral to the log and to your whole plan. Anything else you wanted to add about investigations before we talk about training, Robert?
No, I think we're good. All right, and the regulation or the law, excuse me, requires training, and it requires it for all employees. And there's specific training topics that we have here included. We won't go through every little nut and bolt that has to be trained on. Generally, each employee has to understand the plan, the procedures, their roles. For example, how we can, what workplace violence is, how we can report workplace violence, how that will be handled, and different strategies to prevent workplace violence. Now, in terms of timing, you have to do it when first established. So that was by July 1st, 2024. You have to do it annually thereafter. And then anytime there's a previously unrecognized hazard, where if something happens, like maybe there's a situation, that you did not catch or anticipate during your assessment, and a workplace violence incident happens, where somebody gets on the property they're not supposed to be, you would want to do training about, hey, this is how we handle that situation that we didn't previously assess. So something new that comes up as well. Now, these are all the training topics. I won't go through them one by one. The most important or the most burdensome requirement of the training is the last bullet point, which requires that the training have an opportunity for interactive questions and answers with a person knowledgeable about the employer's plan. So a lot of folks that we know in the employment space got this kind of conflated with the interactivity requirement under sexual harassment, which can be satisfied with some Q&A or some multiple choice questions that are automated. This actually requires a live person to be able to answer interactive questions. A lot of gray area around this. Some folks are doing just 100% live training and having the Q&A portion that way. Some folks are doing kind of a pre-recorded webinar or pre-recorded e-learning, and then having somebody available to answer questions immediately, but making sure you have that live interactivity portion of it. So for the training, you want to make sure you have your platform and your methodology ready to go. How you will handle that interactive part of the training. You're going to want to make sure you track employee training that's required under the new law, that you have a robust record of that employee training, and that it's customized. You want to be careful of any kind of off the shelf or generic training. You want to make sure it's specific to your organization and work site. And then identify who's going to be that person that can answer questions about the plan. And one issue too that we've seen a lot, I think will be implicated in the wine industry is, who's going to be in charge of training the temp workers or contingent workers. We see when there's a lot of temporary labor, CalOSHA takes the stance that the person who controls the work site has to be the one giving the safety training. And we think that they're going to take a very similar stance here, that if you're controlling the work site, you're in charge of workplace violence prevention, that you're going to be training those temporary workers. All right, Karen.
Violent incident logs. So I really want a responsible, capable person keeping the log because it is critical to compliance. So it's similar to a police report, actually. It's kind of like a police report and OSHA 300 log rolled into one. And you've got to be careful not to include personal identifying information. So that would be the name of a victim, things like that. You need to be careful in describing the violence and make sure that you understand the type of violence. And you're going to also have to have the conclusions. Can you go to the next slide, Robert? So the conclusions, what action are you taking? Are you upgrading security? Did you discipline someone? Did you counsel someone? Is someone going for additional training? What are you doing in response? These violent incident logs are going to be demanded by CalOSHA, just like they demand the OSHA 300 logs. So I really like to see someone that will keep them accurately and also can understand the privacy and confidentiality that is required in this document. So I just really like to see maybe someone with an HR or risk management background or that skill set to keep these logs. Now let's talk about record keeping, because record keeping does involve the logs. So you've got to keep the training records. Now, CalOSHA says a year. I like to see training records kept for the life of the employee's employment, in case we do have to prove someone was trained. I also want to remind you that the violent incident log and your hazard evaluations that Robert talked about, you got to keep that for 5 years. CalOSHA is going to ask for it. And don't forget that you've also got to have this plan available to the employees. And when CalOSHA shows up, you need to be able to tender it to them. So having it back at the Chicago headquarters in Mary Sue's laptop is not going to work. That's my closing comment, Robert. I know we've been trying to answer questions as we go along. Did Mike or anyone else see any questions we've missed? Has anyone sent in any other questions? I know we're at 11:57, and we do have
There was one question about, do temporary workers need to be trained on the company's workplace violence prevention plan every year?
Yes. Yes, they do.
Yeah.
So
If they're working there at that time, yeah, absolutely. All right, last call for questions. Anything from you, Michael?
No, this was great. I mean, Robert and Karen, you guys gave great information. And again, thank you, Wine Institute and CSWA for putting this together. Anna or Olivia, do you guys have anything else?
Nothing from me. Thank you. I felt like it was very thorough, and we will be posting this webinar and making it available to everyone.
Yeah, and I'll also send a follow-up email to everyone with all the contact information for everyone who spoke today for any further questions, and then the slides as well. And just want to say thank you so much to Robert and Karen for this great presentation. I think that was really helpful for everyone, and awesome that we'll have the recording to reference later.
we love working with
Like
you guys.
Yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out, and I think that is everything.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all.